Uh, Welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is, as advertised, the Jazz Times 50 for 50 celebration. And what is all the 50? Well, we celebrated our 50th anniversary this year, and it's all in this issue, which you can see backwards, I guess, on there. But it's our 50th anniversary issue, and we decided, well, what's a good thing to do for a 50th anniversary issue? Why don't we make a list? Why don't we make a list of 50 records? Why don't we make a list of 50 jazz records that we really like? So we did. And then we decided, well, since we're having so much fun, why don't we have the readers get involved too? So the readers posted 5 separate polls that are all up on our website, jazztimes.com. And you can see the results of the critics poll, and you can see the results of the readers poll on our website now. And the issue is going to be out officially tomorrow, that is November 24th. So we thought to celebrate that, we should have a special event. We started talking about this back in the spring, and we were going to have a real live in-person event. You remember those. It was going to be at Jazz at Lincoln Center at Dizzy's Club. There was going to be a band playing some selections from the records that we picked. We had the date booked and everything, but 2020. So here we are. My name is Mac Randall. I'm the editor of Jazz Times. Happy to be with you today, and very happy to be with our distinguished panelists to talk about some of these records that got picked for the top 50 list. I will start with Terrylynn Carrington. She is a drummer, composer, educator, and one of the new 2021 class of NEA Jazz Masters. A hearty congratulations to you on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Her credits are far too long to list here, so we'll mention just one. She was a key member of all Herbie Hancock's touring bands between 1997 and 2007. She has won 3 Grammy Awards, including one for an album that made our top 50 list, spoiler, 2011's The Mosaic Project. Carrington teaches at her alma mater, Berklee College of Music. I think you can see that in the background right there. And she also serves there as the founder and artistic director of the Berklee Institute of Jazz and Gender Justice. Terrylynn, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
Next on the list, Ethan Iverson is a pianist, composer, and writer who spent more than 15 years as a member of the groundbreaking trio, The Bad Plus. He has since worked as a leader with a number of artists, including Mark Turner and Tom Harrell. He teaches at the New England Conservatory. His blog, Do the Math, is always a treat to read. And since the summer of 2019, he has been a regular contributor to Jazz Times, penning the chronology column every issue. Ethan, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
That gets us onto the pundits in our group. Ashley Kahn is a music historian, journalist, educator, and frequent contributor to Jazz Times, the winner of 3 ASCAP Deems Taylor Awards for excellence in music writing. He has authored a number of acclaimed books, including A Love Supreme, the story of John Coltrane's signature album, and Kind of Blue, the making of the Miles Davis masterpiece. His most recent book is not a jazz book, but it does cover a subject close to my heart. George Harrison on George Harrison, Interviews and Encounters, published by Chicago Review Press. Ashley, pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here.
And finally, David Fricke is an esteemed music journalist and critic, best known for his decades of work with Rolling Stone. But he's also written regularly for Jazz Times, including most regularly a cover interview with Maria Schneider and a feature on the outstanding LA pianist and composer Cameron Graves. David Fricke, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's just jump into this list. I guess we'll start like we did in the magazine, as anyone who buys it will see. We start chronologically, the furthest back, and then move forward. And we did that in both the readers' polls. So both the readers and critics' polls, I should say. So we start with the 1970s. Ashley, I'll let you take this one first. It is Miles Davis, Bitches Brew, released in March 1970 on Columbia Records. And you've written a few things here and there about Miles, so I figure you probably had something to say.
Well, thank you. What an incredible album to start with. Talk about an era shifting and era defining statement. Of course, this is Miles Davis's double disc masterpiece. Working with this sort of double quartet idea. Some people have talked about how Bitches Brew is like Coltrane's Ascension, but with a groove. You know, and it really is all about the rhythm and the idea of building up from there with very minimal harmonic movements and really kind of uh, you know it wasn't just the approach to the music, but it was really the sound and the use of the studio as a creative force within creating a jazz product, if you will. The idea that the recording itself is a very disparate statement from it's not just the recording of a band performing live. It's the idea of using studio technology and post production, especially in the person of Tio Macero and what he did with splicing together different parts of the studio performance in what would kind of predict where we are today with the cut and paste approach to popular music.
Mhm.
So it was very predictive. It was very groundbreaking. I think most importantly, it opened up a whole new audience to what was called jazz at that point. It was a simpler time too. I mean, in 1969, when this was recorded, the session started just a few weeks after Woodstock ended, as drummer Lenny White likes to point out. Which means it was really at a pivotal stage of our culture. And the idea that a whole new generation was disregarding the categorical definitions of the past and was embracing this idea that they could have next to their Joni Mitchell album, there would be classical music, and next to their Led Zeppelin album, there would be a Miles Davis album. But this was the doorway. This was a doorway for a whole new generation of what had not been considered the jazz demographic to step in, understand Miles, get to know the names of, who's Jack DeJohnette, what's Wayne Shorter about. And then, of course, once you're inside this world, you're going to go back and check out the classics from the 40s and 50s and 60s, and then stay with it as it moved forward. And of course, Bitches Brew, what the children of Bitches Brew, and what they did in bringing that music forward, fusion as we call it, Joe Zawinul, Chick Corea, and John McLaughlin, all the fathers of this whole new invigoration of jazz. It all starts there. So there's so much that we could do the whole show just on Bitches Brew.
Yeah, no question. I mean, just as you say, just following the lines traced by the all the personnel on the record. It's a whole subject in itself. It was also a kind of a controversial record at the time, in part because of that cut and paste approach. It wasn't real. People were kind of monkeying with things. Um,
Because of its title too.
because of its title, sure, and also because of the groove, the very non-jazz groove, and the as you pointed out, the lack of harmonic elements. There's a lot of just jamming on one chord, and people thought that was lazy or whatever. I mean, anybody have any particular other thoughts about that record?
Well,
Not too long.
I can sort of speak to the entrance into jazz from rock, because that was Bitches Brew is essentially what that is to Miles is what the Banana album for me was to the Velvet Underground, Five Live Yardbirds,
Mhm.
the Rolling Stones, Aftermath. It was really the portal that got me into that music. And in fact, jamming on one chord was not a problem for me because I was all about the Grateful Dead and Dark Star.
Yes.
So the idea that you could float over that kind of minimalism and have that much expression densely piled on top of it. And actually, I've told Ashley the story once before. The first jazz record I ever bought was, in fact, a Miles Davis 45. It was a 7-inch edit of Great Expectations that came out just before Bitches Brew.
Huh.
So I bought the single because it was all I could afford. And of course, there are no musician credits. There's no idea what it's going to be. And I just thought, man, this rocks. It's only 3 minutes long. Of course, the entire piece was like a half an hour, I found out later.
Yeah.
But I was like, I'm all about this. And so for me, Bitches Brew, along with a number of other things I encountered in that same general chronology, none of that was a problem. And I went to Woodstock. So having been to Woodstock and then heard Bitches Brew, it all made sense to me. I didn't have a problem. So it was interesting to me when I read later that so many jazz critics were, up in arms about things like On the Corner. And I thought, okay, I understand that they're not hearing what they're looking for. It's just that they're not addressing what's actually in front of them.
Mhm. Right.
That was my take anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point.
Of course, I was 17, and so I wasn't exactly that clued in about anything.
Right.
I have another point on that record too.
Sure.
Just how Betty Davis was instrumental, kind of in pushing Miles a bit into that electric genre, and getting into Santana and Jimi Hendrix and people like that, and even changing his way of look. And so I just think that's also important to mention. I not too long ago watched the documentary, which I'm sure many people have seen,
Right.
with the Isle of Wight. There was actually 2 documentaries, one on her and then one on the Isle of Wight concert, which was really great to see them see that show, in front of that kind of audience, which speaks to everything that you guys have just said.
Right. Yeah, I heard some Betty Davis just the other day on I think it was WWOZ. It was a lot of fun. I was just like, what was that? It took me a second. And I was like, oh yeah, very nice.
Title was her idea as well.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yes, indeed.
Yep.
And of course, one of my favorites, this is, when you really dive into it, there's this memo in Tio Macero's, files that he's
about the title?
Yeah, about the title.
Yeah.
To some upper, person at Columbia saying like, dear so-and-so, Miles Davis wants to call his next album Bitches Brew. Please advise.
It was the first time I heard a word like that publicly, for sure. I said, well, he was way ahead of the hip hop, people and rappers.
The one person who hasn't talked yet is Ethan, but I think I'm going to stick this one on Ethan. The album that he picked that he wanted to talk about for the 70s, a little bit different, certainly in instrumentation, because we're talking about just one person. That person would be Keith Jarrett, and the album would be the Köln Concert. So take it away, Ethan.
All right. Yes. Well, Köln Concert is, one of the most famous albums. It's sort of like Bitches Brew. It has a popular following. My wife and her mother bonded over Bitches Brew. They listened to that a lot. That was just like, they're not jazz fans. They listen to Bitches Brew. My mother-in-law also listens to the Köln Concert.
Mm-hmm.
And I just looked on YouTube, and since ECM doesn't stream on YouTube, the original record isn't there, but someone covered it. Someone plays the whole Köln Concert, and it has 4 million views, which I think says something about, the state of streaming today or whatever. you know, it's it's a huge dinosaur of an album, which, like Bitches Brew, plenty of jazz musicians don't like. It's very non-jazz, perhaps in a way like Bitches Brew isn't jazz. And in fact, Keith played with Miles. He and Chick Corea shared a time playing for Miles Davis, and both he and Chick were extremely affected by the popular music of their day. And Keith, with you mentioned Woodstock, David. I love hearing that because Paul Motion played drums at Woodstock. You know, and then he went on to play drums with Keith Jarrett on a nice cover of one of Joni Mitchell's songs. You know, that album Blue came out, and that really dropped a bomb on all the musicians, I think. You know, for my own taste, I much prefer Joni Mitchell to Electric Miles Davis. Because that Bitches Brew stuff is like, I don't know, man, I need some songs.
Right.
So Keith was really feeling that too. In fact, I think he's one of the few people to play with Miles Davis who then complained about the music, like in interviews. He's like, I don't like playing electric instruments. I don't like damping forever.
Yeah, it's amazing because he was so good at it, but once he had the opportunity, he never did it again.
You know,
I don't think, right?
No,
he never played an electric instrument again, did he?
Well, I think that's not quite true. I mean, depending on how you cut it, you know, but there's a few organs and things that show up, but
yeah,
you know, he's not comping for a Steve Grossman type horn player in a long, funky E minor 11 anymore. That's for sure. Anyway, but just for fun, I mean, okay, so this is the one ECM album we're probably going to talk about today, and I think ECM is really important. And just one little piece of trivia I wanted to blast out quickly is, you know, these two Miles Davis pianists, Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett, they both started working with ECM, which should go on to be, in some ways, the most important label, I think, of the 70s. And Chick actually got their first recording, Improvisations Volume 1 and 2, but the first one came out in late 71. And I was talking to maybe a musician who I won't name right now, but someone who was there at the time, and he said, well, we all thought this was it. Keith, you know, that Chick Corea had solved the future of solo jazz piano. But then, to Chick's disappointment, Keith Jarrett put out Facing You in the spring, which is still probably Keith Jarrett's greatest album in some ways. I just said that, you know, jazz musicians don't love the Cone concert, but they love Facing You. Facing You is just an exhale of beauty. And the influences are really digested. It's just a statement. It's Keith's statement about all the things he knew, including Woodstock, including Joni Mitchell, but it's all like really sort of complex and very elusive. Not to be outdone, for the record, his master, Paul Bley, showed up on the label in early the very next year with Open to Love, which sort of teaches both Keith and Chick something about being a grandmaster of improvised piano. Anyway, this was sort of going on at this time. It's almost like a Beatles versus Beach Boys kind of thing with the solo pianists on ECM. Anyway, that's all rendered moot a little bit by Cone Concert, which was so successful that it severely impacted Keith's career. The last time I saw Chick Corea, sorry, I keep on saying Chick instead of Keith. I mean, really, the gods are going to strike me down. All right, but you know, I saw Keith Jarrett's, which was apparently his last solo concert. You know, he's not going to perform anymore. That seems to be on the record now. And he played abstract fantasies that were more like Facing You, and he played drony vamp songs that were more like the Cone concert. And he told the audience that he wanted to play more like the abstract stuff, but he knew they wanted the Cone concert. I felt some real sadness at this moment. It's like, Keith, you can do anything you want. I mean, anyone can do anything they want. But success is handcuffs. You see it over and over again. You have a huge success, and it's it's really a set of handcuffs. So Cone concert changed everything for a lot of people. It changed everything for ECM. It changed everything for Keith. But my little thing I say about it, it's Joni Mitchell played by a virtuoso classical pianist.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the shapes and the sounds are really kind of like blue.
Right.
And then the super virtuosity and the beautiful tone, a fancy European hall, that's really like European classical music.
Right.
Anyway, so that's my take on the Cone concert.
Right. You made a good point there about ECM, because there are a lot of ECM records on this list. Not too many of them we're actually going to talk about, but a bunch from the 70s. But I actually think, David, you picked one, Dave Holland, Conference of the Birds.
Yes, from 19, actually recorded, it was recorded this next week in 1972, November 30th, and it came out in 73. And one of the things I found out subsequently was that Dave said that the title came from hearing birds singing outside of his window, which really is the idea of melody integrated with this kind of free group improvisation. That's what birds do. They have songs, they have tones and melodies that are part of their voices, but when they're doing it in kind of a mass consort, it becomes something else. And I went back and looked at Robert Christgau's original review of this album in the Village Voice, and he gave it an A, and he described it as free as loose, loose as pliant, and relaxed, and then related the sort of the moods and the themes at the beginning of each piece to, you know, things like Ornette Coleman, Lonely Woman, and the kind of pieces that were on Change of the Century. And I got to say, this record was really part of my immersion in free jazz. It wasn't really from Albert Ayler or Sun Ra initially, but it was actually, and this goes back to Chick Corea, it was a 1968 album called Now He Sings, Now He Sobs, with Miroslav Vitu on bass and Roy Haynes on drums. And then I followed that to Circle, which did the Paris concert in 1971. And really, Conference of the Birds is essentially Circle with two reed players, Anthony Braxton and Sam Rivers, with then Barry Altschul on drums. And it really, having those horn players with that rhythm section really combined melody, theme, that European thing that Ethan was mentioning, but with the melodic underpinning that was a really important door for me, because I still needed hooks. I needed something, I couldn't just walk in. Later I could do that, but to really get into that mentality and to open myself up to free improvisation, that record was a big part of that.
Right. Yes, and yeah, I mean the Rivers Braxton front line is a pretty impressive thing. So kudos to that for that choice. You mentioned Europe. From Europe, we're going to move to South America and to Terrylynn's pick for this decade, Wayne Shorter's Native Dancer, which is another great example of the interaction between jazz and Brazilian music. Please take it away, Terrylynn.
Yeah, this is, you know, one of my favorite albums of Wayne's. It's kind of hard to pick a favorite album of Wayne's because I clearly love all of them.
Right.
But for me, you know, this was an important record because I think it introduced, you know, some jazz heads like myself to Milton Nascimento, whom I had never heard of until I checked out this record. So that kind of endorsement from an idol of ours like Wayne, you know, makes him already hip, you know what I mean? And I thought it was really cool that Wayne went still in a contemporary direction, but a different contemporary direction than the sound that had come from Weather Report within those few years of Weather Report before this album was made. So I thought it was pretty brilliant to, you know, not do something that, to do something that sounded different. And, you know, he was married at the time to Ana Maria, who probably had something to do with, you know, this kind of love of Brazilian music and also the people that, you know, the Brazilian community, because she was very entrenched, in that community.
Yeah, maybe. Reminds me a little bit of what you were saying about Betty Davis and Bitches Brew as well. Just
Yeah.
that, the,
Yeah, I think we're, the sum total of everything, all the people around us too. And I asked Wayne a few questions about it, and he said it was recorded in 10 days. And one thing that he remembers, he didn't really answer much about the music so much, but Raquel Welch, her children were running around because she was engaged to Milton's manager at the time. So her children were running around the studio. I think that's, a pretty funny anecdote. But it also speaks to, I think, the romanticism, of the album, and the romanticism that Wayne has, been so attracted to over the years, which you can hear in, I feel that I can hear in so many of the melodies and the music that he's made. Also, he said that they were all staying at his house, so it was one long pajama party. I thought that was great because it also speaks to community. And I think I've not been in a lot of bands, and I've always wanted to. And I think that's part of the reason I want to, be in that family environment and feel like I'm living with some people and then making some music. And I mean, the closest thing now, at least I, have really close people that I make music with, but I never, had that experience. So, I have a bit of a nostalgic feeling about that kind of thing. Everybody living in a house, creating music. But, the songs like, like Beauty and the Beast, again, so different to me than the Weather Report stuff, but something that, became, like a standard. And it's always interesting to me because there's so much blues in that piece, but in general, you can hear it, throughout the record. But Wayne always says, or has said a couple of times that to me that he doesn't really like the blues, but it comes out in everything he does. So when I think about that and I listen to Beauty and the Beast, I hear this real love affair and real influence of the blues too. And also, I thought it was interesting, like his sound, how it can change on this record, but depending on the song. Like, so the soprano song on Beauty and the Beast is beautiful, but it's kind of dark and it's bright. It's you can really hear the humanity, of him, in his soprano sound. But then on the song Anna Maria, it's a different type of sound, it's a different soprano sound. So those are kind of, things that, I like to listen for. And Tar Day is just I know that's one of Milton's songs. That's just one of my favorite songs of all time. It's so beautiful. And it's, that time for me, when I was younger, listening to songs that, like the end of Tar Day has like the 6-bar vamp. And I was just, getting away from listening to standards and that being, what jazz was to me. So being able to hear these, the things that can happen in a vamp and how these windows and possibilities come in, like one time Milton sang, the melody in the low register, and then the next time, he sings it in the high register, and all these different textures that can be produced in vamps. So I maybe not like some of you, I really love vamps, and I love, one chord over and over to see what could be explored there, But Miracle of the Fishes, I just think Wayne's playing on the tenor is just stupid on that song for anybody that at the time might have forgotten. They put that track on, you don't forget, and his technique. I remember standing next to Michael Brecker in Japan watching Wayne play, and he was playing something really strong and powerful. And Michael, who of course we all admired his technique, he said, "That's just not possible. Like you're not supposed." He said, "That's perfect technique." He said, "You're not, how is he doing that? His mouth is not moving at all." So that's when I realized, how great his technique really was, because, such a strong technician was commenting on it. So anyway, and Anna Maria, it's kind of become a standard as well. So I just think there's so much richness in the album.
Agreed. I should point out for those people who don't happen to know, I did say that Bitches Brew came out in 1970. Curl Concert came out in 1975 on ECM. And Native Dancer came out in 1975 on Columbia. And Conference of the Birds was ECM 1973. So that pretty much covers the 70s. Does anybody have anything else they want to add about any of those records we discussed? Or should we move on to the next decade?
Well, we should just all point out that, you know, everything leads back to one trumpet player. As
Yes.
when we're discussing here, and the music
Right.
that really comes out of the laboratory that was the Miles Davis Band.
Exactly. Yeah. Dave Holland, Wayne Shorter, Keith Jarrett. They were all part of that. So
Credit where it's due. The 1970s,
Yeah.
without the impact of Miles Davis, I don't think would have been nearly as important of a decade as it was.
Let's see. So into the 80s we go, and here's another one who we didn't really discuss very much in the 70s. We did pick a record of his in the 70s, but we're not talking about it today. Fellow named Herbie Hancock, and an album called Future Shock. David, you wanted to talk about this record. Why are we talking about this record out of all the great records that Herbie Hancock made?
Well, this was an interesting record for me because I interviewed Herbie for Rolling Stone at the time Future Shock was a hit, largely because of the single Rocket. And it's interesting because that I actually went back and found that issue, and Herbie was the main photograph on the table of contents page. So that was a big mainstream score for him at the time. And this is a guy who had continued success. He had Chameleon, Headhunters, which is on the list for the 70s. Obviously, all of the Miles connection. I was a big fan of like the Sextant record and Crossings, that Mwandishi period. But the thing that was interesting about Future Shock is that it wasn't even a Herbie Hancock record to start. Bill Laswell and Michael Beinhorn of the downtown band Material had already composed a lot of it and actually taken those tracks on the road for a while. But then Bill invited Herbie to come in and collaborate, and he actually ended up co-writing everything except for the Curtis Mayfield cover, Future Shock itself. And he plays keyboards all over the record. Sly Dunbar is there from Sly and Robbie, turntable action, Laswell and Beinhorn are all over the record as well. Now, everyone assumes that because of the video, which was done by the two guys from 10cc, Kevin Godley and Lal Krem, that was really the thing that lifted Herbie to that kind of stardom. But I think that record really, in the rising age of hip hop, the use of, for what at the time was advanced electronics, and just the New York street rhythm, the whole New York street vibe of that record, it really was an introduction for a lot of mainstream people via MTV and via Top 40 radio into this weird amalgam of jazz, electronics, hip hop, which was still largely an underground music, even in New York at that point. You know, there really hadn't been a lot of breakthrough acts. Curtis Blow, a little bit, Grandmaster Flash, Furious Five were getting some action, but even then, things like White Lines and The Message were college radio hits. They were not top 40. Herbie actually took that culture into the top 40. And I actually think that if that record had stayed a Material album, if it had just been Laswell and Beinhorn, and they were quite capable of doing a great record that way. The previous album they had done, One Down, for Electromusician, a jazz label, by the way, had a cover of a ballad by the British fusion band Soft Machine called Memories, sung by Whitney Houston before she had a record deal. So they were quite capable of making this happen on their own. But I think the fact that Herbie was on it, that he was playing, he had that signature thing that he had brought over from Chameleon and Headhunters, it actually gave that record an impact that it would not have had if it had just been a Material album. then it would have gotten great reviews. It would have been #1 in the Voice poll for the end of the year, and it would have gotten college radio play. Instead, Herbie, both by participating and really being the front guy for this project, really brought a lot of jazz and hip hop into the mainstream at a time when a lot of it was still very underground.
Right. Right.
It
Yes.
was with the Grammys too, right?
And it won Grammys, and it was a visibility that you simply could not get at the time if you were a jazz musician, or B, a hip hop musician,
Right.
or even a synth pop musician.
Right.
He was there doing it all. And yes, MTV had a lot to do with it, but you know, you go with who brung you.
Exactly.
I
and
might
if
have
anything-
one thing to add to that.
Sure.
Well, just in 1983, I was in Menominee, Wisconsin, going to elementary school in Downsville. Menominee was 10,000 people and Downsville was 600 people. It was currently the most lily white belt of the nation.
Mhm.
And I remember them breakdancing the Rocket on the playground.
Wow.
So that shows you the reach. The other thing I like about Rocket is, as we all know, Herbie is big brain, big into gear, big into math,
Mhm.
studied engineering, all that. You know, it's the tune of Rocket. Bop, 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 bop. It goes at one point half the speed. Boop, bop, bop, bop. And actually, it's almost like, does it work? I mean, it works. It's a hit record. It's won a Grammy. I mean,
Oh,
it
yeah.
obviously works, but it's on the line.
Yeah.
And he's forcing it. It's you know, in classical music they call that augmentation, when you double all the values.
Right.
But someone like a classical composer like Milton Babbitt or something uses augmentation.
Hmm.
As far as I know, Rocket is the only hit record that uses augmentation.
All right. Well done, Herbie. Um,
The only thing I just would add, you know, to that is the thing that, I mean, I never thought about it the way you just explained, David, as far as you know, getting more exposure than hip hop could or jazz could at the time. But I did always wonder, or kind of, you know, was pissed about the fact that the video didn't show Herbie on MTV. And you know, so I just think, you know, maybe that was, you know, part of the perfect storm that made it work. I mean, maybe, you know, he wasn't that old then, but I was gonna say, you know, he was older than some of the hip hop kids. So maybe, you know, that was, you know, so you saying that made me be, you know, be a little less pissed that they didn't show him.
and what's funny about it, at least for me, I don't know how much I speak for anyone, but of course I saw that video when it came out, and in my mind, I could swear that Herbie's in the video, but of course he's not. When you go back and look at it, it's kind of a shock, a future shock, if you will, that he's not in it. You know, a past shock. Very strange, but given where MTV was at the time, maybe not that mysterious. Well, moving on, Ethan, we're talking. You picked a record which is a little bit different from Future Shock. Wynton Marsalis, Black Codes from the Underground. If you could,
Yeah,
say a little bit about that.
super classic record. It's great. It's still great. You know, I guess what I like about Wynton at that moment is he's got a band of peers, or even almost elders, that are really playing the way they want to play, you know. And at the time, people were saying it was retro, but actually I don't think Black Codes is retro. I think it sounds just like 1985, like dead center 1985. Like, it doesn't get more 1985 than Black Codes, because among other things, the drummer Jeff Watts was a very fusion influenced player.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he sounds in some ways closer to, you know, a funk drummer of the 70s than an old school swinger. And I like that. That's part of what is the charisma. And then Kenny Kirkland's playing the piano. You know, Kenny is certainly a great straight ahead jazz player, but he has this whole Afro-Cuban thing, really aggressive Afro-Cuban. I mean, McCoy Tyner and Herbie have that too, but with Kenny, it's dialed up to 11. And some of the piano solos on Black Codes are some of the best Kenny Kirkland solos on record, I think.
Yeah.
Also, you know, the last track is a blues. It's just called Blues. It's duo Winton with Charnet Moffett, and it's very fresh and unforced. And I actually sometimes play that. You know, maybe I'm giving a lesson to a European jazz musician who somehow thinks like all that Wynton Marsalis stuff is to be ignored, or they got it wrong or something like that. But it's like, I think we really needed that. I think jazz really needed that. It really needed the way Wynton was playing the blues on that track. I like all those records. It's a sort of a trilogy of the three I like best, with J Mood, Live at Blues Alley. Then something did change. And some of the criticisms maybe started to become more valid, because Wynton really started telling his bands to play a certain way, and he got a certain kind of effect that really was about defining the style jazz, rather than just having a bunch of personalities that played the way they played.
Right.
Of course, that a lot of Wynton's more recent music is great too, but I do think it was the collision of those 1985 personalities, plus the fact that Wynton's compositions on that record are amazing.
Right.
You know, gives it classic status.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
like the cover too to that album.
The cover.
So much message in that image of the young African American students in the classroom, you know, and you know, like something's going to get learned here. There's some very important lesson about to be conveyed, and yet it looks like just another classroom. But you take a look at the student, and he's dressed, you know, in a very, well, now we would say conservative, but very sophisticated, elegant sort of way. And like, I'm ready to learn.
Yeah.
Something new that is going to be, you know, transported and delivered in the music there. And you know, to this day, I think it's one of Wynton's most important statements.
Let's see. I should also say that was Columbia, 1985. That came out. You already sort of said it's couldn't be more 1985. What am I missing here? I'm missing Future Shock. That was 83. I think David already said that too. And that was Columbia, of course. On we go now to, actually, it is another ECM record. Fancy that. Jack DeJohnette's Special Edition album. And Terrylynn picked this album by her, fellow drummer. Tell me a little bit about this one.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people know that Jack is and has been my biggest mentor, you know, for the drum set, and just, you know, opening me up to other things. When I met him, I would say rather closed-minded, you know, about jazz and what it is. So, you know, big props to him. And a lot of his music, I think, helped to open me up as well. And this was one of the albums I remember countless nights, you know, going to hear this band, hear them at the Blue Note and other places in New York. You know, I had just moved to New York, and, you know, revisiting, listening to this album, you know, over this past week was such a joy for me, because I was so nostalgic about it. But yeah, I think the instrumentation was different, you know, for the times, because, you know, in the 80s, you know, a lot of the mainstream labels, Blue Note, Verve, and Columbia, were deciding kind of the sound of jazz. So it was great that, yeah, these recordings on ECM and other less mainstream albums had, you know, such a strong voice, you know, for some of us as well. And this for me was one, because like the tuba, I had never seen a tuba like in a jazz setting. I mean, I just hadn't. So for me, that
Played
was,
by the great Howard Johnson.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, Howard was, you know, has been underrated some, because I mean the solos that he takes on this album is just crazy. Still, you know, just to hear it. But tuba and the bass, because it allowed the bass to do other things. You know, Rufus Reid was playing bass, and his, you know, his bowing created a whole other texture. And then, you know, with David Murray and John Purcell, both being multi-instrumentalists, you had all of this ability for a different kind of orchestration than I was used to hearing. And, you know, Jack and his family are kind of like surrogate family to me. So this album, you know, he wrote for his family and for his mother that had just passed away. And he wrote for a song for his one of his favorite pianists, Ahmad Jamal, song called Ahmad the Terrible, which out of all the songs on the record, I think that's the one that stands out for me. It's also the first track on the record, and you know, I think just the melody is so strong. That really is a standout for me. But the whole album really is. And also, you know, the Chicago sound, like the AACM sound, I think when I listen back, I can really hear that. So I can see the through line, you know, between, you know, say this record and then Jack's, one of his more recent albums made in Chicago.
Right.
Even though they're totally different sounding albums, I can see that through line of the Chicago sound and the influence of the AACM. And I always, you know, always have felt like Jack has had one foot in the future, you know, always. And like on this record, how he's playing with a drum machine, like 808 drum program on, I think, which song was it? Not Festival, New Orleans Strut. Is that the one?
Yes, right. Yeah, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember back in those days, you know, listening to albums like Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing that had that kind of similar drum sound in it. So it's always great to see how jazz musicians take what's happening at, you know, in presently, you know, what's happening in contemporary music, pop music, any of those things, and put it into their music. So seeing him do that also, I think, gave me permission, you know, to do that as well. He also, I remember him playing different albums for me at the time, and Wild Chapatulas was one that he played, and he was a big fan of the meters, you know, which you can hear, you know, on this record. So, you know, and Monk's Mood was just really beautiful. I'm not sure who arranged that, but if it was Jack or somebody in the band, but this just really a beautiful arrangement. And his playing is just, I mean, he was, you know, I mean, people talk about people in their prime. I mean, I think Jack's been in his prime for a long time. You know what I mean? I don't know if that actually works for him, but you know, this time period, of course, his drumming is just phenomenal on the record. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I think this is the only album as a leader that he has on this list, but of course he's all over the place on a lot of these other records. You can't get away from him, not that you'd want to.
Yeah, he's the greatest example for me as a drummer leader, you know.
Yeah.
Obviously he plays piano too,
Yeah.
so he's you know, a fine composer. Unlike a lot of us drummers that don't really play the piano, we, you know, have learned some piano, and some drummers do, but I'm speaking for myself and others that I know that we can't play it like Jack. So so for me, just watching him lead a band, he's, you know, he's influenced my drumming, but he's also influenced me as a band leader.
Well, from a so-called rhythm section player who's made a lot of albums as a leader, we go to another so-called rhythm section player who only unfortunately made two. Jaco Pastorius, Word of Mouth. Ashley, take it away.
Well, thank you. You know, I just got to say that, you know, there's that sort of tragedy that Jaco did not produce anything, and you know, under his own name beyond the second album. There was so much that was so different from, you know, because it was like he was reinventing jazz bass with that first album that he did for Columbia, in the late 70s, the eponymous, album that he did. And then it follows up, and then there's this 5-year waiting period of what is he going to do next? And so much has changed for him, and so much has changed in his career. He's now a member of Weather Report. He's the second album is much more about his compositional and organizational kind of approach to the music. It's not about here's everything that I can do on this instrument, on this 4-string instrument on one album, and I'm going to blow you away, which is what he did. And then he comes out, word of mouth is this, it's another incredible accomplishment, but in such a different way. And on some of the tunes, the bass playing is almost understated, it's surprisingly understated. In other tunes, it's almost like he's adopted a punk rock attitude, with this very distorted bass sound that he's favoring. The opening track, it's almost like a loop that he just keeps doing again and again and again, and it's called Crisis.
Mhm.
And it has this intensity that is just so unsettling, and what it is an incredible kind of reflection of where he was individually, emotionally, at that point in time. And it's this tour de force of musical ideas and also associations. Here he is with this all-star group that has Herbie on it, and Michael Brecker, and Tom Scott, and in the lead position, Toots Thiel,
Right.
is
On harmonica, yeah.
as the primary melodic voice.
Mm.
So, for me, it was so audacious in such an unexpected way. And the tragedy, of course, is that we did not get to hear more from Jaco as things went forward. But what he presented, and what, both as a player and as a composer, etc., we're still dealing with, today. So his imprint, as far as the modern jazz player of that era, set stuff in motion that we're still dealing with today.
Right. I should say yes. He
on Warner's. He had switched over to.
Yes, it's Warner's 1981 on Warner Brothers, and the Jack album was ECM 1984, I believe. So yeah, that's the 80s. Anybody want to add anything about any of those records?
Well, I would just add that, I mean, if you look at who's on that album,
Oh yeah,
you see, where the future headliners, in jazz,
yeah,
with Michael, with Herbie,
yeah,
with Jack, Jack's on it.
right. That's right. Yeah.
Jeanette.
Again, yeah.
And the idea here is that, we really did want to hear more from Jaco.
Right.
And he was sort of an adopted member because of his, role in Weather Report of the children of Miles,
Right.
as we're moving into the 80s.
Yeah.
So that was a long shadow
Yeah.
that Miles cast.
Yeah. He's sort of the second generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, then let's move on to the 90s. We're making a pretty good time here. Let's see. We were joking about this before we went live that Ethan's next presentation was going to be 90 minutes of 1-minute speeches. If you know the album Naked City by John Zorn, you'll have an idea what we're talking about. Again, some people would question whether this is really a jazz record, but let's have Ethan talk about that.
Yeah, well, it's Naked City, I think, is something that had to happen, and that's why it's Zorn's best known record. It was sort of like a perfect storm of right place, right time. I've written a lot about a lot of jazz musicians. I've written very little about John Zorn because I actually don't relate to most of it. When Terrylynn's talking about Jack DeJohnette, or when Ashley Kahn's talking about Jaco Pastorius, Jaco and Jack DeJohnette, I mean, they're taking a lot of influences, but whatever they're doing, it's at a very deep level.
Yeah.
You know, if Jack DeJohnette wakes up one day and says, "Yeah, I'm going to put some meters in my music," it's like, okay, Jack, it's very detailed. You know, Mr. Zorn has done everything under the sun, and a lot of it's pretty superficial. And indeed, I'd hold up that album, you know, plays Sonny Clark as one of the worst records ever made. You know, it's essentially a sin as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, because Mr. Zorn sees Sonny Clark somehow on the spectrum that includes all genres, all of which you can sort of cherry pick and make a punk statement about. That said, Naked City lands. He's got an incredible band, and there's incredible punk energy. I mean, I think punk actually owes a lot to Albert Ayler and 60s free jazz. So then it goes through some kind of noise rock and punk and stuff, and then we end up at Naked City. And of course, Zorn's alto playing is sort of closer to 60s free jazz than Cannonball Adderley. That's for damn sure.
Yeah.
So, but you know, I remember when I got Naked City as a teenager, it was like a blast of something. And this was before the internet. So he's putting all these things next to each other that you wouldn't get otherwise. He puts Henry Mancini and other movie themes next to Yamasuka Ai, who's screaming the throat punk, as well as in writing all these sort of pretty banal appropriations of style that all happens in this collage fashion. And it was heavy. It was a great moment. I loved it. And my last little story about the record is I've had a lot to do with dance, and one of my mentors was the very great, now deceased Pearl Lang, who was Martha Graham's number 2 for several years. Then Pearl did her own choreography, and I was working with her. And she came to me one day and said, "Ethan, I need music for a rape scene." And I'm like, okay. So the next day I brought her Naked City, and she never gave it back. So my copy of Naked City is in the Pearl Lang papers, wherever they are deposited here in America. So that's my Naked City story.
I see. That's a good one. Well, it clearly was appropriate.
Well, I totally second this emotion because not only do I love Naked City, I got to see that band live in New York. They played at a place, I forget the name of the venue, and it was a punk club, and they just blew it out. And the thing that was really interesting about that night is there was one piece on one of their Japanese releases that was it was 1.5 hour kind of like marching drone with a lot of soloing and Zorn going nutty over it. They opened the set with that 30-minute piece. Then they came out and did everything in 45 seconds and less, and it just blew everybody's head off. And in many ways, it actually was a full circle for me, because you mentioned Ethan, about Albert Ayler and how a lot of the punk, came through that. One of my first important records was the Stooges' Funhouse. And of course, Steve Mackay is the saxophone player on Funhouse and LA Blues. And that is all about Albert Ayler and how Coltrane was both of them were very big influences on the Ann Arbor and Detroit rock scenes in the 60s via John Sinclair, who managed the MC5. And in fact, the first Sun Ra song I ever heard, I use it loosely because of the way it was interpreted, was the MC5 playing Starship on their first album, Kick Out the Jams, which was recorded live at the Grandee Ballroom. And it's all distortion and free playing, feedback, everything a 16-year-old kid in Philadelphia wants to hear. So to me, Naked City was almost like a sum total of everything that I had heard in all of these other places. And we got to give it up for the 2 guitar players, yes, Bill Frisell and Fred Frith, who are playing completely out of their normal sort of settings, and yet totally rocking it out with that incredible rhythm section. Right. And I just thought they were just amazing. That was one of the greatest live nights I've ever had.
Great. And that album, also, you said that was on None Such, that came out in 1990. From what I think we could say was possibly insensitive music, we go to a little more sensitive music. Cassandra Wilson, Blue Light Till Dawn. That was another pick of Terrylynn's. A brilliant album in a completely different way. Though it's also got some wonderful guitar playing on it, but again, of a very different sort. Terrylynn, take it away.
Yeah, just like you said, it's a brilliant album, and I just feel like we were all ready for this type of album, when it came out in the 90s. Because I mean, Cassandra is definitely a jazz vocalist. I mean, whatever that means. I mean, people, I guess, have different definitions of what jazz is, but her level of improvising and just her sound identity, all of that, is very much in the jazz arena. But this record brought in all of these other elements. Just to me, her universal understanding to tell an appeal to telling stories is what made her such a standout to me on this record, because everything was stripped away, like all the the things that can kind of clutter sound behind a vocalist was kind of stripped away, and we were really left with hearing the richness and clarity of her voice and of her sound. So you would start thinking about people like Nina Simone or Odetta or even Abbey Lincoln or Jimi Hendrix or Billie Holiday, and people that we really related to storytelling. And I think, part of that, of course, was her choice in producers. Craig Street, who, I believe was a carpenter. And this was his first major label production. And he was also one of the, I think, founding members of the Black Rock Coalition. And Black Rock is, to me, essentially blues, electric blues or acoustic blues. But I had played on one of her previous records, which was Blue Skies. And, that record was great. And we recorded that in 2 days live to 2-track. So there's like no punching, nothing. It's just what it is. And I think she could have, really quickly identified, herself or established herself as that kind of jazz standards singer. So I think a lot of us were surprised, when this record came out. But I think it was such a great move and vision on Craig's part, and I'm sure in collaboration with her, because if you know Cassandra, she's definitely a collaborator. I don't think anybody's just telling her what to do. So I'm pretty sure a lot of this vision came from her as well. But just because it's so steeped in the blues and what some might consider folk elements, and of course the jazz elements, I think it makes us look at what is, this kind of Black American sound. It's kind of pushing us in different ways to look at what that sound really is. And also with, you can hear, the deep ties to Africa with the tracks Sankofa and Black Crow and Estrellas, which is cool because you could hear like freedom, like some of it might for moments sound kind of like free jazz, but then you'd hear these deep African grooves. So, I think it pulled us in these different directions and had us have to just kind of let go of our own, our own silos of what we think, the music should be, or what we think, jazz vocals are. Yeah, and she's always herself, and I think that's an important lesson a lot of people learned from Miles Davis, is how to be yourself, keep your own sound identity, but the things around you can change, but your sound and, your own identity is really clear. And I think she's done that over the course of her career. Yeah, I think Betty Carter, I know she's told the story how Betty Carter helped her with this and with finding her own sound. Because I think, in her earlier years, she really loved Betty Carter, and then Betty Carter told her, basically, get your own shit,
Yeah.
basically. So And those are, really important moments, for somebody, for an artist, to develop their own thing. I mean, I can relate to that because I think as much as I love Jack, I had to keep trying to find something, find my own identity. Right. So I can see how that worked well for Cassandra.
Yeah.
And it's just a beautiful, beautiful album. The covers and the balance between cover songs and originals, and her writing and some of it too.
It came out on Blue Note, 1993, and one of my favorite critics here at JazzTimes, Thomas Conrad, he's not shy of making definitive statements. I think that's why I enjoy his stuff so much. And he wrote the blurb for this in the issue, and he says, it starts, "This is the best record by the best female jazz vocalist of her generation." So there you go. Thank you, Tom.
And we're glad that there's critics that are so keen to make those kinds of statements. Only you guys can do that.
That's right. Exactly. It's kind of like, yeah. I wouldn't want everybody saying that, but sometimes when he says it, I enjoy it.
Mac, I'm so glad that you mentioned, Blue Note. Yeah. But we should, shout out to Bruce Lundwall.
Oh, yes. Well,
in the door to this project and believing in it at the start. I mean, this album, everything that Terrylynn just said, so true. Right. And for me, it connected so many disparate dots in one's record collection, because she was doing Robert Johnson, later, Neil Young tunes, and making it all make sense within this general rubric of jazz. And it was all, new. It was so new and so groundbreaking. And her style, and I'm so glad to hear that Betty told her, don't be doing what I'm doing. Go and get your own stuff. It's so understated. At first, it undersells itself. And knowing her, it really is sort of this breakthrough album, not only for that period but for herself. I mean, it's really where Cassandra becomes Cassandra. We know and love today.
Ashley, you picked an album by another great female vocalist for the '90s, Shirley Horn. Here's to Life, which came out on Verve in 1992.
Yeah, this was such an unbelievable kind of step backward, and yet it celebrated the timelessness of really great voice, material, and arrangement. I mean, what Ella was with her songbook series to the late 50s, this album in and of itself, Shirley Horn's Here's to Life, it came across as that one great, magnum opus that Shirley had been wanting to make for so long. And connecting her with Johnny Mandel, who not only, did all the arrangements, but produced the album, and with...
And who passed away not long ago, this year, along with many others, sadly.
And with new songs by Alan and Marilyn Bergman, who are, were like the surviving recipients of the Cole Porter and, Gershwin, kind of lineage of great American songs. It really was, it just showed how there was still so much more that could be done with that great American songbook kind of approach with a great vocalist. And, a lot of people talk about Here's to Life, which became her kind of theme song for the rest of her career. But tunes like Return to Paradise, hearing her do that live at the Vanguard, those are moments that I'll never forget, and it just said, okay, there's a place in this world for all of this great music, and it hasn't died off. It isn't just of the 40s and 50s. It's as important today as it ever was. And this album was just such a surprise, and it garnered Grammys. It was a huge critical success, and it punched new life into Shirley Horn's career, of course. You know, it took her to the, you know, when we lost her. But you know, shout out to Richard Seidel, who's at Verve, you know, get all the pieces together on this, and truly believed in Shirley, you know, to this point. Such an amazing album, and you know, totally out of left field, given what it really was kind of reflecting. But it is up there and as important, as I said, as any of Ella's songbook series, or Billy at her best, you know, Sarah, really, you know, cemented Shirley's, you know, position within that, you know, that level, that top tier.
Right. And it really started that, as you said, it really started that second act or third act or whatever you want to, you know, call it, but really pushed her into the public consciousness. And
I just want to shout out Shirley Horn's piano playing.
Oh,
So, which, you know, Billy Hart keeps telling me that because he was in the Shirley Horn trio at the Vanguards opposite the Miles Davis Quintet with Herbie Hancock. He's convinced Herbie took a few voicings from Shirley Horn. So whatever it's worth, I believe
wouldn't be surprised. Wouldn't be surprised at all.
I thought it was funny how in the issue you have the Anita O'Day
Yes.
before and after. And it's just, has everybody seen that?
As I said, it's officially out tomorrow, but a lot, you know, subscribers already have it, and other people have got it. Digital subscribers have it. And one of the other things in the issue is we've been doing these so-called before and afters. Ashley has done a bunch of them. We've been doing them for now over 30 years. And they're, you know, listening sessions. You play music and you don't tell the person what they're listening to, so they start talking about it. So you get the transcription of what they said before they knew who it was, and then after they knew who it was. And Anita O'Day is, I think, the earliest one. I think Leonard Feather did that in 1992. And we just used one exchange really in there. But a lot of them are like that. She has just about nothing good to say about anybody. It's pretty entertaining.
But specifically that record.
That's right. She does.
That's
really right.
Yeah,
And someone mentions her. I think Leonard mentioned her. I'm flipping through it right now. Mentioned her connection to Miles.
yeah, and she said, well, she couldn't have learned much from him because he didn't know what he was doing.
He didn't know what the hell he was doing. Yeah, so she couldn't learn much from him.
That is worth buying the magazine.
Well, thank you. Now we've given it away, but that's okay. On to David, our last pick for the 90s. And you picked Brad Mehldau, Songs, Art of the Trio, Volume 3.
From 1998. And actually, I think the Volume 3 is a very key part of this, because it was part of a series of records, which was really, you know, Brad, I think, looking to find his way into and through the piano trio tradition that, you know, goes back to Bill Evans, Oscar Peterson, Wynton Kelly, you know, so many others. But actually, for me, what really connected on this record initially was the juxtaposition right next to each other of his version of Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, a Rodgers and Hart song, with the very elegant menace of exit music for a film from Radiohead's 1997 album, OK Computer, because it really summed up what I saw in Brad initially at the time as a pianist, an improviser, a band leader, but also his idea of the so-called Great American Songbook was not limited to the middle of the 20th century, and it wasn't limited to America. You know, there was a body of song that could be explored with the same commitment and the same invention that, you know, Miles, to use a frequent example here, was doing with Surrey with the Fringe on top. And also, you know, the original composition on that record, for me, is compelling and actually quite provocative in a lot of ways. But it was I connected with it because I was born really in a time when I got to hear guitarists like Hendrix, Jeff Beck, and Keith Richards. I can hear them changing the music that I loved and doing it in real time, because those records were brand new to me. They were new records when I heard Beggar's Banquet or when I heard Beckel, Electric Ladyland. And I think Meldau, who was born in 1970, for him, that spread also included Radiohead. It included Bjork and the Sugar Cubes, and it actually included a guy who I really loved, Nick Drake, the British singer-songwriter, and his original Island Records albums in the early 70s were very beautiful and fluid fusions of folk and modal British jazz from that time. And I have to say that this then in turn connects to one of the bands that is not included with this list. That is the Bad Plus. Because a lot of what I heard in Brad Meldau enabled me to connect immediately with Ethan, Anderson, Dave King, when they were doing, and obviously I was starting with the version of Smells Like Teen Spirit, but also the original recording they did of Knowing Me, Knowing You by ABBA, finding spaces and avenues in these compositions that I knew really well from their original incarnation, and showing me that there was a new place to go. There were new voices in there, and you know, the road goes on forever, as the Allman Brothers said. And the last time I saw Brad, he played a gig at Carnegie Hall in that recital hall, the second hall downstairs. It was a solo gig, and it was one of his Bach interpolations concept deals. But at the end, he did a couple of encores. He did After the Gold Rush by Neil Young, which was a beautiful essay inside that ballad. But he also played The Who's Pinball Wizard. And what he did was he took that opening guitar riff, that manic strum that Pete Townsend does, actually on an acoustic guitar on the original single, but he did it with the percussive intensity of McCoy Tyner. And it was just a great moment that felt exhilarating. It was the same thing. Yes, I got seeing Ethan with the Bad Plus at the Village Vanguard for the first time. When I saw you guys actually do War Pigs by Black Sabbath, there is jazz in there. Please, you know, open your minds. And this is a trio album, so we have to have big shout out, great support and invention from bassist Larry Grenadier and drummer Jorge Rossi. So it is the art of the trio, Brad and the whole band.
Ethan, I apologize to you on behalf of JazzTimes critics.
I wasn't letting that go.
Yeah, sometimes they don't.
It's all good. Think of well, you know what, actually there's plenty left off this list.
Oh yeah, well we're going to get back to that.
And so I actually don't think Bad Plus is the most grievous omission. There's plenty of people that deserved a place before the Bad Plus on this list.
Well, we're good. We're going to talk about some of them in the last little bit of this show. I do not think we're going to be able to quite make it through all these records, so I'm going to skip it. Ethan, you picked for the 2000s. You picked Black Stars by Jason Moran. So tell me a little bit about that one.
Yeah, real quick. I felt such a sense of relief when I heard Jason Moran, Taurus Matin, and Nasheet Waits play a gig. I will never forget it. It was a life-changing moment. There was something I was missing, and they supplied. I would say the Meldau trio with Larry Grenadier and Jorge Rossi, and then also this great Kurt Rosenwinkel quartet, Kurt's band with Mark Turner, Ben Street, and Jeff Ballard. They were sort of, for me, the flagship groups, essentially my age, a few years older, but like, this is what I wanted to be influenced by. But then I heard Jason and Nasheet and Taurus, and it just was like, this is the answer. And it had something to do with the avant-garde, it had something to do with black music, the blues. On Black Stars, they meet Sam Rivers. And I think Sam he gets a little bit of a short shrift because I think he was a real mentor to Tony Williams. And I think all those 60s Blue Note records and stuff, and the Miles Davis, the Plug Nickel, all that stuff, really Tony was a big part of that, but he learned a lot of that from Sam Rivers. And you can hear the Tony Williams and Nashi Waits playing on Black Stars, and it's sort of like a perfect amalgamation of whatever we love from the heyday of jazz abstraction circa 1964 and a new thing, Houston. You can really hear the hip hop on this record too, you know, and they're the time and place, and I'm just really happy they're out there and they're still doing it. God bless the bandwagon.
Yeah, absolutely. Ashley, for the 2000s, you picked Pilgrimage by Michael Brecker. We were going to get back to him eventually, and here we are. It's sadly, it was his last album, posthumous. I think that it's on the list for more reasons than that. But why don't you please go into that a little bit?
I'm happy to say that I was actually invited to some of the sessions when Brad was and of course it's such an all-star group with Pat Metheny, John Patitucci on bass, Jack,
again,
who keeps coming up, and it's just a powerhouse album that does not sound like someone who is dealing with a medical condition, dealing with his bone marrow condition that he was dealing with. But the backstory is as powerful as the music itself. The fact that he was able to get his strength together because they were not able to find a blood donor who was a match, which is what he desperately needed. So it's his daughter's blood that she was giving back to Dad so that he could get up to speed. And the music is to this day is just so wonderful, and it reflects where this incredible complexity that's underneath the music, but the emotional impact that it always had when Michael was playing. His matchup, especially when he's playing Iwi parts with Pat Metheny, is so wonderful. The arrangements and the tunes that they put together. He's working with Gil Goldstein on a lot of the tracks are just so wonderful. It's like one of those things that doesn't sound like someone saying goodbye. It's full of life. It's full of what made Michael just so special. And his solos, especially on Anagram and the title track, are for life. I mean, they are going to be with us forever. And there's this one tune that sounds a little bit like Song for Bill Bauer. I'm forgetting Tumbleweed. That's it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I took some notes here. That's cheating. But I think Herbie's on that. Herbie's solo, Pat's solo. It was just, it would have been like another great Michael Brecker album. And that was his gift to us, that he did not allow the sadness of what he was dealing with to impede on the music itself. And it never did, throughout his career. It was such an incredible high point for him to leave us with, this incredible Pilgrimage.
Great. All right, 2-album warning. We're shifting to the 2010s. I'm going to put it next to David Fricke, who picked Kamasi Washington, the epic, which came out on Brain Feeder in 2015. I should also say that the Michael Brecker album, Pilgrimage, came out in 2007 on Heads Up. But Kamasi Washington, again, a little bit of a controversial figure, but tell me why this album is important. I think we all agree that it's important.
Well, for me, actually, this album really resonates because it's a document of a great live ensemble. I really liked the album when it came out. And yes, it is an indulgence. It's a 3-record set. It's actually 3 hours long. If you get the vinyl, each side is like a half hour long. But I got to see the band play at the Winter Jazz Fest in 2016, right after the album came out. And the force in his voice as a saxophonist, the drive of that band, the different voicings they had, the Patrice, the woman singer, the trombone, the two drummers, which can immediately connected to me, because one of my favorite things is seeing the Allman Brothers peaking at the Beacon every March. So that double drive really connected with me. And it's interesting because in talking to Cameron Graves recently for the feature that is in one of the recent issues, one of the things that's interesting about that record is that although Kamasi is billed as the leader and they are his compositions, it's really an album by the West Coast Get Down. It is really the sum total, the initial sum total of that scene. And one of the things that Cameron pointed out was that they never really got to make a record as a group. Every project was kind of a different angle depending on who was leading. And I think that the epic, in terms of its ambition, the power and invention of the various voices that are moving around in there at any one time, it's just a wonderful immersive document. And it was a way to hear, and it has that spiritual quality that I love in Pharoah Sanders and a lot of Albert Eiler's work. His could be a lot more extreme and almost aggressive, but very plaintive and very gospel oriented. You know, he was basically adapting hymns in free jazz. And I think Kamasi, in his way, was doing exactly what I needed, certainly in 2015. And the one thing that is just it's a huge drag on so many levels, but a band like Kamasi and all the other cats that come out of that scene, they could be killing it live right now. They should all be playing at Bonnaroo. They should all be playing at Pitchfork festivals. They're the kind of artists like Herbie with Rocket, Miles with Bitches Brew, that could be extending the traditions, the timeline, and the language in settings where people would be new to this. And I think it connects most just convincingly in a live setting. That said, I'm glad I have the epic. It really is the epic.
Absolutely. Okay, last album, we come back to Terrylynn. The album is, get ready, Radio Music Society, Esperanza Spalding, and Terrylynn plays on this, don't tell anybody. But that came out in 2012, is that right? Let me just make sure I've got my facts straight here. 2012, yes, on Heads Up / Concord. Again, breaking some boundaries here from what we would normally call jazz, but that's part of the fun, right? Terrylynn, tell us about it.
Yeah, I guess, I never quite understand some of that of what is jazz and what's not jazz. But, you know, for me, she's a jazz musician, so her slant on anything else is jazz. I mean, you know, I think she even called this record, you know, more of her, I don't know what word she used. You know, I don't think she used the word pop, but, you know, she saw it as, you know, something that could be played on the radio, you know, on other radio stations, you know, other than jazz radio. But she can't help herself. You know, she writes in odd time signatures. I mean, I can't hear one on some of the record, you know, some of the songs on the record. I mean, you're constantly trying to figure out the phrasing. I mean, that's jazz, you know. But I think, you know, Esperanza, she came here with her own thing. People aren't very quick to call women geniuses, but I just feel like, you know, if nobody else, you know, is going to, I'm going to, you know, do it as often as I can, because I really do feel that word is appropriate for her. She's just this unyielding well of creativity. She's never stagnant. She keeps producing, whether you like what she does or not. It's on a high level, and she keeps doing it. She can't, you know, she doesn't have any downtime. You know, she's not just a lyricist; she's a poet. You know, she's not just a a songwriter. She's, a composer and a great bassist, acoustic and electric. And, her singing, if she didn't sing, this record would be great if somebody else was doing the singing, Um, and she's, such a conceptualist. I mean, they made a video for every song on the record. So it's kind of like a movie, and it really connects the dots to the narrative of this record. She's completely committed, to her choices, and they're often out the box. Like just for example, Joe Lovano, he's playing off through "I Can't Help It." It's a Stevie Wonder song that Michael Jackson did, and just her casting. I mean, if you look at the credits on this record, I mean, the drummers are myself, Jack DeJohnette, Billy Hart, and Lyndon Rochelle, which is there's within all of us. I mean, there's a pretty big array of drumming styles in there. But I mean, even like the horn players, I mean, some are really jazz players, and some some classical musicians on the record, which I think spoke to the continuum from chamber music to radio. I mean, I think it actually, with the strings, because radio is often looked at as a horn, like a big band kind of record. And though her mentor, Thera Memory, did arrange a student big band, which is great, giving them a shot for a couple of their tracks, you also hear the strings that were continuation from chamber music, then, of course, her political consciousness always comes through in everything she does. There's a song called Land of the Free. James Wideman, playing organ. Like, I didn't know James Wideman played organ. It's just like, even a song like Let Her is reminiscent of Steely Dan, in some ways. But then Vague Suspicions, I mean, you can kind of hear maybe how people might start, thinking about Joni Mitchell and how she may have influenced Esperanza. Though I'm not sure at that time how much, because those kinds of references came later with Esperanza, but I'm not sure how much Joni Mitchell she was listening to. But, and then she has hip hop, a singer, Algebra is on there, and also co-wrote a song with her. So she has all these worlds colliding together, but it's still an amazing jazz album. With like, even with the big band stuff, like some of the things Thera Memory arranged of just classic jazz big band type writing. So yeah, even like, to me, one of the most commercial songs on the record is called Crowned and Kissed. It's one of my favorite songs on the record. But like, it was hard. I played drums on that track, but it was hard to figure out like how to play in a commercial style with these bars that weren't adding up. I couldn't, just play a backbeat, So I don't know. I just think it's a brilliant, brilliant record. And yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Agreed. And so we've talked about a bunch of records here, which is not as many as the 50 we had on the list. It's not as many as the 50 we had on our in our readers poll list, many of which were not the same as ours. But even so, say it's 75 records, it's still not nearly enough to cover anything. It's a nice gimmick to celebrate a 50th anniversary, but inevitably a lot of people get left out. I actually, if you pick up the issue, you'll see that I kind of complain a little bit about it myself, because there are no Ornette Coleman albums in this list. The reason for that is because people just couldn't agree. Some people voted for science fiction, some people voted for Dancing in Your Head in the 70s. 80s, some people voted for Song X, some people voted for In All Languages. And but it didn't add up. So I just left it as is. I did not play God, but I was kind of disappointed by that. Another thing that's kind of disappointing, which is kind of a good segue out of the album that Terrylynn was just talking about, which has so many great female instrumentalists on it, is the lack of female instrumentalists on this list, which is sadly in some ways a reflection of the history of jazz. But it also in some ways just more, and yet another unfortunate oversight. I can think of one person in particular whose name stuck out to me. Now, she appears on other people's records, at least one other person's record on this list, but she's not represented on her own, and that's Geri Allen. And I believe, Ethan, at one point, I think this is a quote, you said that there's jazz piano before Geri Allen and jazz piano after Geri Allen. I don't know if that's quite what you said, but close enough, right?
Well, yeah, I think that, I just mentioned Jason Moran and Black Stars. Like, okay, Jerry's a big influence on Jason.
Mhm. Yeah.
Vijay Iyer's on this list. There's no Vijay Iyer without Geri
Right.
Allen.
Yeah.
For whatever it's worth, she's a big influence on me. As other people who win polls from critics, David Varellis, Matt Mitchell, Craig Taborn, so many others, Chris Davis, it's a long list. It's probably more common these days in a way, that school, and that's because she was a real alternative. I remember the dominance of Kenny Kirkland and Donald Brown, and then there was Marcus Roberts, and then she had this other thing in the 80s. And Terri, I was there a couple of times to see you play with Esperanza and Geri, and I always really enjoyed those gigs. Everything Geri did was great, but her playing did change. In the 80s, it had this sort of avant-garde lunacy that was so attractive. With Ralph Peterson, she was an incredible X factor. Sort of like Eric Dolphy was an X factor. Geri Allen had that. And I think for the people I'm talking about, we caught that and we're like, oh yeah, that's that thing I like, which you don't hear, even a record with Ron and Tony, you don't quite hear that the way she played in the 80s. I saw her live at that peak, maybe it was 88 in Minneapolis with Anthony Cox and Verona Clough, and it was an incredible gig. Apparently they played the Vanguard, and it really sort of felt like this was the new band of the era. Anthony Cox told me McCoy Tyner came down. It was like a real vibe. That particular trio did not record, but you can hear some of the repertoire on her first album, Printmakers. There are a couple of albums with the great hometown rhythm section of Jared Bouchard and Tani Tabal. One has some trio cuts, Twilight, and then Open on All Sides in the middle has horns. But you hear that. If you want to check out Geri as the leader, I would say those 3 80s albums have something really influential.
Yeah. If you had to pick one, here's the terrible question, right? If you had to pick one to start with, that would go on this list. Which would you?
Well, now I'm going to cheat, and I'm actually going to list a different record, which is the one with Charlie Hayden and Paul Motion called Etudes.
Yeah.
And that's a classic record, in my opinion. Also because there's something about jazz history there that was really unforced. Those guys played with Bill Evans and Keith Jarrett. They're sort of known as the Bill Evans, Keith Jarrett guys. And she brought the Herbie Nichols and the Elmo Hope and the Thelonious Monk and that sort of lineage. And it's a really kind of a perfect meeting. They made several records that are all good, but that first one, Etudes, there's just like a snap, crackle, pop. It's like a perfect record.
I do have a soft spot for the Printmakers just because of that lunacy that you referred to earlier.
I also like Homegrown. Some of her solo piano stuff, it sounds like she has 3 hands.
Those are her first 2 records on Minor Music.
Yep. And I like Printmakers too, so I agree with you, Mac. And Twilight, that was like that, moving into another area of her playing and writing.
Terrylynn, does any other name come across, anyone you would have put on this list?
I didn't really think about that, so I didn't know we were going to be asked that, so I don't want to just off the top of my head. I don't even think in these terms of best. This is a fun discussion to have because it's all good music.
Yeah.
But personally, it's very difficult for me to pick a top. People that are critics, I really don't envy the work that you do, because it's impossible for me.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who writes about music, I will second that. It's I don't think about these things as lists. I
Yeah.
think of it as, these are important way stations through which you pass and through which time passes.
Mhm.
And I mean, what's the point of a recording anyway? It's to
Mhm.
kind of preserve a musical idea and moment. And then the musicians move on, and so should the audience. But I see these incredible recordings as ways of opening us up into certain scenes, like David was talking about. The role of Kamasi Washington's epic is this window into an incredible world that many people don't know about, that's going on in LA, you know. And that's the importance there. It's that you don't just land on the epic and stay there, but that you continue the exploration afterwards. And I think all of these recordings kind of reflect that. They're of a moment, or they show you what was happening, in this person's career or whatnot. But that, then you continue to move on. So that the idea of creating a top 10 list or a top 50 list or whatever is really just, these are important doorways that you have to know about, that are going to lead you somewhere else.
Well said.
David, I'll give you the last word on this. Anyone else you'd want to add, or any final comment you'd want to make?
I made my pitch for the Bad Plus, so hopefully I did some good there. One of the records that I didn't get to talk about, and it actually gets to an aspect of music that I think we expect, but we don't always get to articulate, is, and you had asked me to talk about Sonny Rollins' Without a Song, the 9/11 concert, which came out in 2005, but was recorded 4 days after 9/11 in Boston. And there's a whole story behind that. Sonny Rollins was downtown in his apartment when the Twin Towers fell. He stayed there, and as a result, he ended up with a lung condition, which essentially took him off the road. But when I actually interviewed him in 2016 and very specifically asked him about it. And he said that, I foolishly tried to play because I had to stay in my apartment overnight. So it was like the act of playing actually affected the way he could conduct his art really for the rest of his life. But the thing that is really amazing about that record, and it gets to the whole, and we've all mentioned the spiritual aspects of how this music has changed and informed us. Here's a guy coming to Boston 4 days after one of the worst days in American, indeed human history, and he stands up and performs Why Was I Born? Where or When? Yes, it's the standards, but with a whole different angle, and a tribute to both lives that are lost and the human spirit that continues. And there were shows like that in New York that I saw right after 9/11. I saw Wilco, Laurie Anderson, who famously said from the stage, when the going gets tough, the art gets good. And what Sonny Rollins did in Boston those 4 days after 9/11 was really heroic. And I'm so grateful that he put it on a record, and that he had the fortitude to do it. And so many of the artists everyone's talked about have done that in their way, in their time at that moment. And I'm just really grateful for it, because every one of the records we've talked about, that I've written about, all of the records behind me here, they've all been portals into something that I didn't know, and that enriched my life in ways that I can never begin to say enough thank yous. So thank you to everyone on the panel for doing that, and to everyone who made these records, because if it wasn't for all of them, I'd still be a kid on Breach Street in Philadelphia trying to figure out what the hell to do with my life.
Well, I think that goes for all of us in some way or other. We are grateful to all of them, and to more that we did not mention here, but some of whom you can, yes, read about in the December 2020 issue of Jazz Times, which says Going Gold, our 50th anniversary issue. Thank you so much. I'm also grateful to all of you for taking part in this. Ethan Iverson, Terrylynn Carrington, David Fricke, Ashley Kahn. I'm Mac Randall. I hope you enjoyed it. I sure did. And let's all just do this together in person sometime. How does that sound?
And happy birthday, Jazz Times.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
We'll accept that. Take care.
So thank you.
Yeah.